1, 2, 3, 4.
You're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening.
Hello, my beautiful listeners, and welcome to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast, and I'm your host, Lance Morgan. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Brooks E. Hefner to talk about his new book, Black Pulp, Genre Fiction in the Shadow of Jim Crow. Brooks E. Hefner is a professor of English at James Madison University. He's the author of The Word on the Streets, the American Language of Vernacular Modernism, and co-director of the NEH-funded Digital Humanities Project, Circulating American Magazines. Brooks, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Lance. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited for this. It's going to be a fun episode. Listeners, Brooks has decided to skip our usual reading, which I will leave more time for our conversation, and I'm excited by. And it will make sure you go and buy this book so you know what the reading is. And give a little intrigue. If you want to know what the words are, he's not giving it to you. You have to go and buy the book. So I love it. I love this. You're taking away from the listeners, giving them a little bit of mystery, you know?
Exactly.
That was the brainstorming behind it, guys. It was we leave you wanting more, leaving you wanting the written words. But please go check it out. I love the cover of the book, by the way. I wanted to say it's very it feels like a noirish, like I feel like I'm gonna every time I look at it, I'm like gonna like there's like a woman smoking on the cover, a beautiful woman smoking on the cover, and I'm just like, wow, what's her story?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I was really happy when the press went with that image. It's from a black produced film from the 1940s called Dirty Gertie from Harlem, USA, which I definitely encourage people to check out. Does not show up in the book because I'm talking about all print stuff in the book, but it seemed very much in the time and the spirit of what's happening in the book. So
well, and to go on that, since we're not doing the normal book reading, could you give the listeners a little introduction into this book through your own words, a little summary?
Sure, absolutely. So Black Pulp is really a book that is trying to fill in some of the big gaps that we have in the history of genre fiction, and especially in the history of genre fiction in African-American literature. I've spent a lot of time working on genre more broadly, and kept running up against some of these questions about, what was popular reading matter for Black America in the early 20th century when really the genres that we know today are kind of being formulated and coming together and developing all of their characteristics. And this really sort of happened in one of those strange ways that a lot of research happens, is that you find one thing and that leads you to find another thing, and then suddenly the floodgates have opened and you've found a lot of things. And that's kind of what happened with this project. So so the book does a couple of things. It kind of goes into that world and seeks to shine the light on a lot of popular fiction that has been pretty much forgotten. Most of it appeared in the pages of newspapers that were published by and for Black communities in the United States. Many of them had national or large regional distribution. So on the one hand, it's about finding these things that people have forgotten about and elevating them as part of an important history of genre in the United States. But the other dimension of it is a more interpretive argument about how genre formulas work, and how ultimately the history of genre is pretty problematic in racial terms. And it's, yeah, right. And it's, I mean, these are genres. I mean, I think one of the phrases that I use is that most of our genres were forged in the fires of white supremacy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right?
I mean, genre, as well as many other topics, right?
Absolutely, right.
Right. But I mean, a part of me is hearing them like, yeah, like, you know, that
right.
I feel like, especially recently with everything that's been like all these like the topic of like critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement, every time I hear like a new thing about this was affected by white supremacy and racism, I'm like, yeah. I mean,
right.
what isn't, right?
Right, exactly. So part of what I wanted to do in this book is highlight the ways that these writers really disassembled those genre formulas and rebuilt them in service of narratives that are really invested in racial justice. And I think we have this perception. I think often this is the case where we can always be very presentist and think that we are so much more advanced in our thinking or so much, better at X or Y or Z than people were 80 years ago or 100 years ago. And in some cases is absolutely true, right? But one of the things that I thought was so fascinating about the stuff that I discovered in the pages of newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Baltimore Afro-American is the very things that you're talking about, like critical race theory, these ideas of, and the debates, like the Oscar so white debate and and these arguments about representation.
Yeah.
These things were actually happening in very interesting and lively ways in the fiction from the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s that I spend most of the time talking about. And so I think it really is important for us to see this as a longer conversation, a longer tradition of really thinking about how to remake genre for a more just world. And that's kind of where, that's the sort of big arc of the book. And the book looks at a number of different genres. It looks at romance, looks at science fiction, right? It looks at kind of adventure stories, and really thinks about how these different genres do different sorts of work in the world, and how these writers, many of whom, never got much credit. Some of them were semi-professional writers or amateur writers that they're writing in, in their spare time, in the evenings and weekends, kind of, probably not getting paid a whole lot. Right. I mean, it's serial fiction for the most part.
Right.
And it's newspapers that didn't have huge budgets. So
I'm guessing, were there a lot of pseudonyms too for a lot of these writers?
There were a few. There were a few, but actually what was really interesting to me is the way that writers who might have written for, or who wrote for the African American newspapers, used pseudonyms to publish in pulp magazines.
That makes sense.
Right, because they were concerned about the perception, especially if someone might sort of suss out the fact that they were African American, and then suddenly there's these anxieties about writers publishing in pulps, which were largely a very white space, and a space that as I mentioned, tended to kind of operate on some of these very deeply racist assumptions. Let's say that's all of pulp fiction, but that's the kind of baseline that you're working from in the pulp magazines.
And because I think of very racist. It's so funny because when I like first heard of your book and heard of this, I thought, you think of like the opposite with these like racist like popular stories, like you think H.P. Lovecraft, you think H.P. Lovecraft, you think I can't think of, H.P. Lovecraft has so much there. I literally blanked out so many other names, but there's so like in some ways, like I'm not gonna try, I'm sorry if I'm shitting on a lot of your favorite authors, listeners, but like Scott Fitzgerald has a lot of racist overtones in his books. Again, I read a book. Listeners, I can promise you, I promise you I did not scam my way into this by pretending that I can read. I promise I did not. Um, no, but I mean, there were so many authors from that time who were like writing overtly racist things.
Absolutely.
So like
Absolutely.
to find out, I mean, this also reminded me of like, the Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the
Mhm.
sense of this city that was prospering and no one really knew about it
Mhm.
till
Exactly.
because like it was hidden from a lot of in a lot of like history context and history and talks about history and the deep-rooted racism in it too was hidden from a lot of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And I felt like, for my own work as a scholar, Lance, when I started working on this project, I'd been thinking a lot about race and popular genre as one of the things that I've come back to repeatedly in my work. But I got really tired of kind of splitting hairs about like, well, this writer is is a little bit less racist than this other writer, right? And I thought, wait, this isn't really a productive way to go about this. And I sort of decided I need to kind of scrap this and see if I can actually look for something in popular genre that really has an anti-racist agenda. And I mean, if you're going to do this, you have to go to Black publishers and Black writers. And I think that was so key for me. And really kind of the goal is to shine the light on these long forgotten writers who didn't get the credit they really deserved, I think.
I mean, once again,
yeah.
But right. Also like with that, I mean, I feel like a lot of usually when you hear this, a lot of when people are like, oh, I want to find this, but there's probably not a lot of writers like this. They look for new writers because like back then there was not a lot of writers of color, but it's like, no, there was. You just weren't looking, and no one was. Right. You have to. It's the work that a lot of people don't want to do to actually look for it, because there's a lot more work in trying to find these writers and publishers, because they had to like they were buried or had hidden or had to do or publish their stuff in ways that weren't as popular or promoted as the white authors and other publishers, and people don't want to do that work. So
and you're absolutely right, Lance. And I think one thing that it adds difficulty to is there is an archival problem when it comes to black print.
Right.
So the newspapers that I spent the most, well, I have so many weird anecdotes. So sorry if I overload you with weird research anecdotes, but
go for it.
But there's the two newspapers that I spend the most time on. One was out of Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Courier, and one was out of Baltimore, the Baltimore Afro-American. Afro is still running. It's one of the longest running, I think it may be the longest running Black newspaper in the United States. Still does very important work and has especially been doing a lot of great work during the pandemic, covering Black community in Baltimore. And one of the things that I think is really was surprising. I mean, these were large circulation newspapers. They were not small fly-by-night operations. Baltimore Afro-American actually had, publications in other cities, Richmond, DC. They had other editions that kind of in the region. But there are almost, I mean, I think the Afro-American actually has an archive where they have all of the copies of the newspaper, or virtually all the copies. But the only place most people can access anything is either on microfilm or through a digital service, and even that is incomplete. I mean, these are some of the most widely circulated Black newspapers in the 20th century.
Right.
Pittsburgh Courier, Baltimore Afro-American, missing issues, missing pages from issues. It's really a bit of a mess.
Like a library of Alexandria, like kind of thing.
Right.
Where it's
it's like that kind of thing. There's one series that I talk about here in the book by a really fascinating writer named Gertrude Schalk, and it's set in a Harlem cabaret. And each story is about a different dancer in the cabaret. And this was published in a smaller circulation newspaper based in New York called the National News. Very short-lived. It was run by another figure that I talk about in the book, George Schuyler. There is maybe one place in the country that has any physical copies of this newspaper. That's
wow.
Because they threw them out. People threw them out. Newspapers were already seen as kind of ephemeral objects that you didn't need to worry about keeping because who cares about yesterday's news? But then at the same time, for African-American newspapers, this was sort of, a doubly violent kind of act in terms of just erasing some of the record of these important newspapers. And there are many papers, there's nothing left. We know they existed, but we don't know, we don't have any access to them. So, that's one of the reasons that people don't know about this, is that access is hard. And in some cases, it's just lost.
Well, it seems too like, I would assume, because, in an amazing way, but also in kind of a sad, depressing way, everything, Black people have done to promote themselves is a act of revolution in a way of trying to be an act of revolution, an act of protest, an act of it has to be an act of something, which white oppressors of course see as an attack on their white normalcy, attack on them, attack on their ideals and beliefs, which it is, only because this country specifically, but this world in a lot of ways, is anti-Black. So anything pro-Black is revolutionary. So I have to assume that hurts too, the preservation of that history, because white oppression would not want that the anything historical or of Black historical context to thrive. So,
that's the story of the forgetting Tulsa, right?
Exactly.
Right. It's exactly what you're talking about, right? Exactly what you're talking about.
Or any kind of revisionist history. I think of
exactly
a lot of the one that whenever I think of revisionist history, I remember in middle school being taught the Alamo and how the heroes of the Alamo were the Americans, 100 Americans who died there. And then I think back and I'm like, wait, wasn't Mexico, that side, the only ones who weren't, the only people they didn't kill were the slaves, because they were like, oh, these people were forced to be in this position, so we will not touch them. And I'm like, wait, man, hold on. Wouldn't you say they're the heroes then? The ones who weren't killing slaves? I would assume they're the heroes there. And that's what I think of with revisionist history, of people doing things like that. I mean, and that I feel like, that idea of revising history, this wouldn't be good. Black fictional stories that would last 100 years now.
It's
not, they wouldn't want that. So it makes sense that it's very hard to find. Why this specific time period though, from the 20s to the early 50s or late 40s?
Usually most of it ends in the early 50s.
Early 50s, okay.
So part of the way that I kind of came across this was an interest in pulp magazines, and that's also the kind of heyday of pulp magazines in the United States, right? They sort of begin in the teens-ish. They really take off in the late 20s, survive the Depression, but then in the early 50s, the pocket paperback appears. I guess it's the late 40s really, but then by the early 50s, the paperback original sort of shows up, and suddenly people would rather buy a salacious pocket paperback that they can stuff in their pocket and get on the bus or the train or what have you, than buy one of these larger magazines that are just full of stories. People want a longer narrative and that sort of thing. And so in some ways, what I'm talking about really parallels the pulp magazine peak. Black newspapers had fiction really from the very beginning in the 19th century. And there's some scholars that do really terrific work on the 19th century. Up through the 20s, kind of the mid 20s, most of the fiction that appeared in these newspapers was kind of didactic, right? It was really I think I used the word tendentious in the book. So it sort of promoted a very particular idea, right? So it was idea driven, first and foremost, right? So and in some ways, some of the work that appeared in those newspapers has already, at that point, has already been recovered, or it was reprinting people like Charles Chestnut or other writers like that. But in the late 1920s, some of the newspapers start experimenting with genre fiction, and that's when you first see the newspapers really publishing a lot of original genre fiction. And there was a little tabloid insert that showed up in late 1928 that was distributed. I think 34 different newspapers had it at one point, or that's what they claimed. Probably had a circulation of over 200,000 nationwide. So really large circulation.
Yeah.
And it really is churning out new original genre fiction for 3 or 4 years. And it's actually owned by a white advertiser, which is a problem. But it's edited by a couple of really interesting figures. One of them was George Schuyler, who was also a writer and has a very weird history. He was a socialist in the 1920s. By the 1960s, he is like shilling for the John Birch Society and calling out, Martin Luther King as a communist and all this sort of stuff. But in the
I can only imagine him talking about Malcolm X. Oh God.
Right. Yeah. In the 1930s, he's still really kind of interested in forms of Black liberation. So, he's one of the first editors, and then the second editor actually became is Ben Davis Jr., who later became the lawyer who defended the labor organizer Angelo Herndon, and Ben Davis then becomes elected to New York City Council as a communist on the Communist Party ticket. So really interesting figures, right? Who are involved.
Yeah, like people who, it seems like a lot of like origin stories for a lot of like important figures in American history.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. So these two guys are involved as editors with this, and then once this tabloid section essentially peters out because I think no one trusts the owner advertiser, the biggest newspapers that were carrying it start just editing their own fiction. It's like the appetite, they discovered the appetite was there, and they run with it. And so the Pittsburgh Courier produces or publishes genre fiction through the end of the 1930s. And then the Baltimore Afro-American is going strong into the early 1950s. Every week, it was great. It's really a kind of very cool story about this one little thing that then sets off all this other stuff, right?
I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about how they were owned by this, owned by a white advertiser, right?
Yeah.
That, one, it sounds very familiar, or very familiar, or very relevant now when you see a lot of I feel like there's for the, I was going to say for the past 10 years, but 20 years, 100 years, there's been a conversation about, white publishers and white editors being in charge of the work of Black people coming in and being, I was just watching the show Love Life, the second season of it. I don't know if you watched that.
I haven't seen it.
One of the main characters is an editor, and one of the main problems is that his bosses, or junior editor, and all of his bosses are white, and they're saying, oh, we don't know if Afrofuturism will sell, or we don't know if this Black author there's an audience for them. And so they're kind of gatekeeping the work, even though they have the main character is Black still, but they're like, oh, we'll have this Black guy, do his thing, but we're still in charge of it. And it seems like that, that's almost parallel to this.
Right. I mean, and it's a history as long as the, narratives of enslavement, right? Where you had to have like a white abolitionist write the intro to sort of, authorize what was coming after it.
I mean, what do you think of Black liberation or slavery? Who's the name you always hear? Abraham Lincoln. And
right.
It's like he's freed the slaves. And I'm like, all right, guys. There's a lot more to that story.
Sure.
But but sorry, I interrupted you.
No, and I mean, you're right. I mean, this was particularly a big deal in this period because especially this sort of starts at the peak of the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, there were white editors and publishing houses that made a ton of money during the white Renaissance, or during this moment, because they were thinking like, oh, well, it is what Langston Hughes said when the Negro was in vogue, right? So that's what he called the moment, right? Is this sense in which people wanted to buy books. It was fashionable to buy and support Black writers and artists. And so, you had patrons and you had other people involved controlling. What seems to be the case here is that that this guy was pretty business minded, and he wanted to make a buck. He was an advertising agent. I didn't find any evidence that he really sort of controlled the content. He was playing a sort of long game that failed. He was essentially trying to use it as leverage to sort of start a kind of Associated Press type news service and kind of have a monopoly on that for Black newspapers, but it didn't work. Right. So he later goes on to found a totally different magazine company that did not have anything to do with these Black newspapers. So the really interesting thing though is that the editors who were involved, at least Schuyler, goes on, and really I think Carl Murphy for the Afro-American became heavily involved toward the end of the section's run, and they really take control. And so it's a bit more encouraging of a story about control and representation and decision making than you normally hear, which is part of what really intrigued me about this whole phenomenon.
It sounds, I mean, like it's. I feel like it's one of those studies in history to like really understand also what's happening today too with it. I mean, like, because history repeats itself, but it also sounds like, there's another story about a white man in charge, using Black art to, to use Black art as a stepping stone for more things, which like
absolutely
is also like not anything. It's not history. It's still happening today. It's not it's not new and it's not old. It's current. It's contemporary. I want to ask you, because you are not Black, but you're covering this heavily Black topic.
Sure.
How was it for you coming into this as a researcher and writer and collector of these facts, not being Black and going on this journey for yourself? Because I imagine there must have been a lot of inner turmoil for you about covering this, and a lot of in dialogue with yourself on how do I do this in a respectful way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question a lot, Lance, and you're right. I mean, it's I'm a white guy, right? I have spent a lot of time writing about race in the work of white and Black writers in the United States, but probably more working more with white writers. But I do think that there was a moment for me where I really felt like I needed to use the privilege and access that I had to stuff like these databases and whatnot, to try to be a microphone for a lot of these authors that people had sort of left behind. I really wanted in this book not to, I didn't want the book to be comprehensive in any way, because I didn't want to give the impression that I somehow controlled or mastered all of this work, right? You know, I think, you know, I wanted this to be sort of the opening of a door, right, for other people to encounter this material, and for me to kind of step out of the way and let them see. And there's a lot of because there's so little of this is easily accessible. There's a lot of summary in the book in terms of, you know, talking about different series and characters and for that reason, I really kind of wanted to be someone who amplified these voices, because I feel like it's super important right now. And I think, you know, we're in a moment where we really are thinking a lot about, you know, the intersection of race and genre more broadly. I think it's one of the most interesting things that's happening right now. Yeah. You know, you mentioned Lovecraft, and Lovecraft's having a weird moment, but in part he's having a weird moment because you have Black writers who are writing back, right? N.K. Jemisin, Victor LaValle, people like that, who are doing these really interesting kind of transformations, which is part of what I'm sort of arguing that these writers were doing in the 1930s. Right. So you know, I came at this again. Hopefully, it comes across in the book, but with great respect for what these writers were accomplishing, and with an intent to amplify and to broadcast some of these exciting examples of anti-racist genre fiction that, you know, are just otherwise lost to contemporary readers. And I think also this idea that, you know, as you mentioned before, the hysteria around critical race theory and all this sort of stuff that's happening right now. I mean, part of this is, I finished the book long before, you know, CRT was something that, you know, an acronym people cared about.
Right.
And
it's so crazy hearing that conversation, being like, "What? Do you guys think it's new? You guys
right,
think this
right.
is
but this is part of the idea, right? Is to say, well, no, I mean, there were these writers, and some of it is about, you know, being able to help get recognition for the writers, for the publication venues, for the print history that is really rich in, especially in African American newspapers. There's a lot of this early on. And to give credit to people for making really interesting innovations in what we think of as these really static, sometimes very static genres. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that kind of makes sense. You know, I mean, it was also, I think I started this research on this around the first emergence of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and I think for, you know, a lot of many scholars, certainly not all scholars, but many scholars, I think, really were concerned or thinking about, you know, how can I do meaningful research?
And I think, I mean, there is, especially for, for white scholars trying to do research, I know that there is always a worry of like, oh, am I using, again, like we were saying before with the white advertiser, am I using these Black topics to you know, further my own goals?
Sure. Yeah.
And I mean, there are others who don't even ask that question and do it. There's like today as we talk, today is January 6th, and the 1 year anniversary of the insurrection. And I mean, there are a lot of white politicians out there right now who are using that for their own political gain. Yep. And then I think there's other books. There's a book by an author whose name I won't say, but which is like a thoughtful critique on, I'll tell you afterwards who it is, after the re-record, but it was a thoughtful critique on his opinion on a famous Black writer's work, where I'm just like, this only seems to be for your benefit. And so I know a lot of Black people specifically have that fear of of just like, oh, is this what, there's like a little bit of, you know, fear of like, oh, am I being used instead
Right.
of studied? Or like, how would you tell other how would you tell other white people in academia who want to study topics like this to go about it?
Wow. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think
Or advise? No, you're not.
yeah. Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah. Gosh. I mean, I do think that it's important to recognize all of the folks who have been part of the project, and I really tried to do this in, for example, in the acknowledgments where
Mhm.
I had worked with so many terrific archivists and
Mhm.
librarians who were without whom the project would just simply just wouldn't exist, right? And the archives, there was a lot of weird detective work that had me, running down obscure writers and trying to find their descendants, and again, trying to give as much credit as you can to the people whose work you are working to amplify.
Mhm.
So I think that's important. So all the credit across the board as much as possible. I was fortunate to be able to present some of this work early on in my own institution in what's called the at that point it was called the Africana Literature and Cultures Workshop, kind of workshopping it with a lot of a real diverse group of faculty who put it together. And so I think working with colleagues and friends, getting feedback as much as possible, not trying to claim ownership over anything, or I think that's a really big thing to deal with. And again, that's kind of the idea that the book is an opening, and I hope that people will come and disagree or build or amplify, challenge or extend some of the claims that I'm making here. I think it's really important, but I also think, I think the flip side of this, Lance, is that I think that it's I think white literature scholars have an ethical obligation to contend with Black literature.
Yeah.
Like I think that it's because I think the idea that that white scholars should stay away or should I'm sure that that all of us have stepped in it at times and made made gaffes, and I'm certainly know that that I've been guilty of that, but I think we have an obligation to center those as part of the the national literary history and the national conversation, because I think that's precisely, you talk about January 6th, the whole, this is all about decentering experiences of Black people, right?
Exactly.
And so, that's, I apologize for my slightly clumsy answer. I don't know that it could be
No,
anything other than clumsy, but
I think
hopefully that makes sense.
It's, there's no easy answer.
Yeah, there is no easy
There's
answer.
no easy answer. So it has to be, clumsy. If clumsy is better than no answer.
Right.
And no, and
Right.
also, like, I feel like there's, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, like a fear of being wrong and a fight back. A lot of the whenever I hear white scholars, whenever I hear white scholars who I disagree with talk about it, it's usually because they don't have the ability to be critiqued. They are,
Right.
I'm right. And usually it's a lot older, scholars who are like, I've been doing this for years, and
Right.
like the rigidness of it. They're like,
Right.
I know
Right.
what I'm talking about, and you're wrong, kind of
Right.
thing. When
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
especially the white scholars you're talking about who need to like center, not or decenter white white literature history and white literature context and all this, they need to also be willing to say I'm wrong, right?
Yeah,
They need to be
absolutely.
willing to go up there on the podium and say I'm wrong, because the people whose experiences I'm researching and I'm doing the work on tells me I'm wrong.
Right.
there's and like there's that for topics of women, topics of queerness, topics of indigenous culture and
Absolutely.
South American culture, um, on and on. Like the list goes on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we all have to be able to say, oh, I was wrong in this example, and I am going
Right.
to keep on continuing the journey to be better, because no one's
Yeah.
perfect. We all make
No,
mistakes.
that's right. That's right. You're
They
absolutely right.
to quote, I feel like I quote this a lot, but like to quote one of my favorite television shows, the reason they make erasers on pencils, because we all make mistakes.
There
We
you
all
go.
make mistakes.
Right. Right.
And you know, and we're white culture, we're coming for you. You're over. Your time is done. Your time is over. I'm announcing it right now on this podcast episode. It's done. You had your chance. It's over. Well, you can put that on. You can put that down. It's over. The last thing I want to ask you, because sadly we have to wrap up soon. Even though this has been so much fun, I could go on for another 3 hours, but
it's been great.
it's been so much fun. The last thing I want to ask you though, you have a extensive background in academia and on the topics of like American fiction, like popular like genres. You said it earlier, genre writing, film, film culture, you know, some contemporary culture to contemporary like fiction too.
Less so. I tend to be an early 20th century type scholar, but yeah.
But I mean, you've taught this and you've researched this a lot in your career. After writing and researching this book, have you found that a lot of the things that you're researching or the context that you're looking at all of this in has changed?
What exactly do you mean?
Like in teaching,
right.
like American fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or when you're in your or researching like the silent film era, or
sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like even like literature and music and all this from this period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now that you've seen like, you know, or now that you've researched how the kind of gatekeeping of Black fiction writing or genre writing or all of these things, has your context of all of what you've learned changed? Has the context of like how a lot of these authors that you might have taught before been like, oh wait, I learned that blah 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 was affected by maybe that author in that way?
Right. Well, yeah, I think for sure. I mean, I think we're you know, part of the you know, the way that I think about it in the book is using a sort of this term articulation, where everything's kind of connected to everything else, right? And some of those connections are invisible to us until we see them, right? And so I think that you know, Toni Morrison has this really great book, a very short book about American literature called Playing in the Dark. And part of what she talks about there is the kind of the way that African American experiences are kind of always in, you know, somewhere. They're always sort of present in, you know, you're talking about Fitzgerald is a really great example, right? And that it's very easy if you want to center whiteness to just forget about those parts, right? And I think one of the things that has been really interesting for me in doing this work is reading some of these stories made me realize the way that the formulas are actually working in some of the other, like the sort of mainstream sort of white pulp writing. Because when you see a writer, you know, who is not even really getting paid much, you might even be just, you know, writing on the nights and weekends, kind of disassemble and reassemble the genre in a way that you're like, wait a minute, this becomes like a really devastating critique of the formula of these other things. So it's always kind of on my mind now when I'm looking at genre fiction, you know, how it wants to present race, how it wants to think about questions of racial justice,
Right.
Or ignore them entirely, right? I think one of the chapters that I had the most in some ways the most fun with in this was the chapter on romance, because you think romance is like the most apolitical genre ever, right?
Right.
But it's only apolitical, if you are ignoring the kind of the sort of boundaries that are of acceptable let's say pairings, right?
Right. Exactly.
Within the stories. And so once you sort of begin to step back and see that, then suddenly you can see how some writers that I talk about in the book are really interested in upending that, upending who's an acceptable partner, or what's an acceptable kind of woman to be in a romance story. Those sorts of things I think are actually really part of what I think I've taken away from the research that went into this project.
No, I mean that. Yeah, I feel like that's something that, like, a person who gets that gift of, like, which is happening right now, I think, especially in like a lot of like our new pop culture, in the sense of like, I mean, Watchmen,
Sure. Right.
that opened up a lot of eyes on like, oh wow, this is, look at this, look at what we did. But I mean, a lot of books I'm reading are talking about like the Tuskegee experiments.
Yep.
They're using, but they're not talking about it in like a, this is what happened. They're talking about like how it affected culture, or like in fiction, like how it can, how like this was a big part of history enough that it should be included in fiction work.
Absolutely.
Like, I'm watching Underground Railroad, the show, and it's like, based on the Colson Whitehead book, which is a fantastic book.
Yeah. But
we're seeing that on screen. We're seeing something like that on screen. We saw the Lovecraft Country tackle it.
Right.
There's a YA book that I was reading, The Black Kids, talks about how it relates the Rodney King riots to the Tulsa massacre, like how how those two separate things can be related.
Right.
And like it's so important to think about like why this wasn't talked about before, and also maybe it was talked about before, but why we didn't know about it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, and I think that's sorry, go on.
No, I mean, and that's, I think your point is right on. I mean, in the ways, one of the really kind of interesting things about that I ran into here, because these were published in newspapers, that sometimes there's like the front of the paper and the back of the paper talking about the same thing, right? So there's a whole serial about racial covenants in housing, and it was happening. The serial was happening as the Supreme Court was hearing a case on the constitutionality of racially based covenants for housing purchases. And so that sense of how the fiction can speak directly to the moment, and can take up some of these big issues, I think is really part of what I wanted to highlight, the amazing and really fascinating genre work that some of these writers were doing, like bring it into an adventure story, but also think about how can we imagine solutions to this.
Exactly. And I feel like sometimes, oh God, this, not to talk about your book in any context related to this at all, but sometimes you see some of these topics hidden in academia, because a lot of the world don't have access to a lot of academic text,
right,
or access to like a lot of language that academia holds, so they might not be able to get through the text to find it. So a book like this, where it's like, oh no, there was fiction, there were stories, there were these things that were told that like did that they tried to reach the public, because like stories have throughout time have been how like regular people have been able to like get information about things,
Right.
open their mind on things.
Right. And,
So,
and process problems and imagine solutions to those problems.
Exactly. Because, it's all metaphorical. It's like all like, not metaphorical, what's the word I'm looking for? It's all metaphorical, kind of like fiction is metaphors on like how we process things in the real world. So why can't, I feel like a lot of there was a agenda of hiding them in academia for so
Sure.
long that it needs to be brought out to the light. And I think like a book like yours and like the fiction we're getting, the specifically Black, but also like a lot of other cultures, that those stories that are being told now are important for that work. So that's fantastic.
Thanks.
Well, no, thank you for bringing this book to us. Listeners, please check it out. There is a lot of interesting and a lot of really good topics or fiction, like research that you've dug up on these stories that need to be done. And I feel like, especially now in 2022, where we're going to be I feel it that we're going to be seeing a lot more of these stories on page and screen told. It's so important to know the history of that, and especially if you're making these stories, do your research. You might find the next Watchmen in this, the next Lovecraft Country series in this.
Right.
But it's worth it to check out. Thank you so much, Brooks. This was so fantastic.
Thank you, Lance. I really appreciate it.
No, this was a great episode. Do you have any last words you would like to say to our listeners or the independent bookstore community as a whole?
I would just say support your local independent bookstore. Buy lots of books, read lots of books. And I hope to get out to SKYLIT sometime in the future.
Oh, we would love to have you come over. Well, thank you, Brooks. Thank you so much to our listeners. I am always so happy for you to come back, but if you're listening for the first time, welcome. We have a big catalog of episodes, and we have a great lineup coming up for you in 2022. So check that out as well. But thank you for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Do something nice for yourself. See the sun if you can, but if you can't, hold out, it's coming. Look at a picture of the sun. No, you have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.